May I ask folks to please sit down for the panel to begin, please.
Thank you, Professor Doyle. Good morning. Welcome to panel 2. The title of this panel is Collaboration and Normalization. My name is Edward Miller. I'm a professor of history at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. In this panel, we have 3 excellent papers by 3 junior scholars. All of them are PhD candidates at different institutions. The way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce all of the panelists now. We're still actually short one panelist. Hopefully, Tien-Dung is coming. There she is. Okay, come on down. You can sit in the front row here with your fellow panelists. So I'm going to introduce all of them. They will each come to the podium and present. And then after the presentations conclude, the 4 of us will sit on the stage and we'll have a conversation with all of you. Our first panelist will be Nguyen. Thanh is a PhD candidate at Yale University, and the title of his presentation, as you can see, is U.S. Civil Society and the Reconstruction of Vietnam, the Case of Scientific Cooperation. He will be followed by Tien-Dung, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Stanford University. Her title is Governing the Dead, Transnational Politics in the Identification of Vietnamese Martyrs. And our final presentation today, Zachary Tayler, not to be confused with the 12th President of the United States. Zachary is a PhD candidate at Ohio University, and his title is The Path Forward, the United States and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, 1986 to 1988. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Thanh to come and present to us.
Hello everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you Ed for the introduction, and thank you for the US Vietnam Center and Berkeley's Institute of East Asian Studies for organizing this very auspicious gathering. And without further ado, I will present on my paper, US Civil Society and the Reconstruction of Vietnam, the Case of Scientific Cooperation. Well, thank you for listening to this rather grandiosely titled presentation. I hope to make up for it with some colorful slides. So my topic today is alternative actors and factors in US-Vietnam relations. And instead of talking about heads of states or diplomats, I would like to explore the role of scientists and scientific cooperation. Specifically, this paper explores how scientific cooperation continues the people-to-people diplomacy that had, during the Vietnam War, brought US civil society groups into a cooperative relationship with the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and later the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. In other words, it is in part about the afterlife of anti-war activism in the United States and its role in US-Vietnam relations after the war, which I think is a somewhat understudied topic. And within this topic, my specific focus is on scientists for a few reasons. I think that science has a somewhat special meaning in post-1975 US-Vietnam relations. As is well known, the normalization talks that took place in the late 1970s broke down over a variety of factors, but the result was a prolonged embargo imposed by the US government on the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. This embargo rests on a distinction between permissible humanitarian assistance and unpermissible development aid. It's often referred to as a trade embargo, but in fact the prohibition on development aid has a wider implication. It would preclude most techno-scientific transfer to Vietnam, which was important in the scheme of the post-war Vietnamese government in the reconstruction of the country and the development of what they envisioned as an advanced socialist economy. And so it is into this gap that US civil society actors stepped up. In particular, I would like to highlight the role of academics, professionals, and activists who have opposed the war and now engaged in humanitarian assistance to Vietnam in the form of medical and scientific aid that their government was not willing to provide. Now, scholars have shown that in the 2 decades between war and normalization. The boundaries of US-Vietnamese relations were drawn around what counted as non-political humanitarian issues that the two estranged governments could still cooperate on. And the case of scientific cooperation demonstrates that humanitarianism was always a contested issue. While US officials focused rather squarely on the search for missing US soldiers and the resolution of and accommodation of Indo-Chinese refugees, American scientists who supported Reconstruction and normalization with Vietnam tried to broaden the concern of humanitarianism. They reminded the American public and tried to remind the American officials that there was another kind of humanitarian needs, the hardship faced by people in Vietnam as a consequence of US wartime policy, and especially the use of destructive technologies in war. These scientists tried to hold the US accountable for Vietnam's reconstruction, and they argue that precisely to address these kind of alternative humanitarian challenges, the two governments should normalize relations, and scientists in particular could take the step forward and prepare the way for this process through academic exchanges and charitable assistance. And this talk will proceed in two parts. The first part will provide a brief sketch of the wartime roots of post-war scientific exchange, as I just outlined. And the second part will give a brief account, hopefully, of the most significant science diplomacy initiative of the 1980s, an organization called the US Committee for Scientific Cooperation with Vietnam. And so on to the first part. The roots of post-war scientific cooperation between American civil society and the Vietnamese state lay in the transnational scientist movement against US military intervention in Vietnam. And in the United States, we can see here the more radical anti-war activists among scientists coalesced around Science for Vietnam. This is a movement founded in 1971 in Chicago, but quickly spread as it was a decentralized movement. It opened chapters across North America and Western Europe. And scientists who were associated with Science for Vietnam were galvanized into opposition to the war when they witnessed the use of advanced weapons and technologies for destruction, the unprecedented volume of bombs dropped on Vietnam and Indochina, but in particular, the widespread use of defoliants like Agent Orange during war. Science for Vietnam was openly left-leaning and inspired by Marxist analysis of contemporary problems. They saw Vietnam as the focal point of a global struggle against imperialism and capitalism, which had exploited, in their view, science and technology in the service of warfare and exploitation. And so they called on scientists in the West to literally cut ties with the military-industrial complex and to contribute to the Vietnamese resistance by sending books and supplies to Vietnamese institutions, by engaging in collaborative research projects with Vietnamese counterparts, by publicizing research on the harms caused by instruments of war used by the US, and also by providing political education to their readership through inexpensively produced pamphlets and newsletters. On the more moderate side of the political spectrum, we have another aid initiative called Friendshipment. This is not a scientist-run initiative, but it's rather a coalition of pacifists and church groups who came together for the first time in 1972 to raise funds to donate for the reconstruction of the Bạch Mai Hospital in Hanoi, which has been damaged during the Christmas bombing in 1972. And this organization will keep doing their people-to-people aid diplomacy well into after the end of the war into the late 1970s. And even onto scientists who were more established and of a more liberal leanings, we have Scientific Aid to Indochina, an initiative by the Scientist Institute for Public Information. And here we can see the involvement of who I think is a quite interesting person, Dr. Arthur Galston, a plant biologist at Yale University, who had campaigns against the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. And he has a quite personal reason for doing that. It was because his doctoral research was used by the US military in the development and weaponization of the defoliant. And it was Galston who later coined the term ecocide to describe the US's use of herbicide for war in Vietnam. Galston is also someone who's very active in science diplomacy. He had run a pretty successful people-to-people exchange projects with the People's Republic of China, which paved the way for the resumption of relations between Washington and Beijing. And Galston wanted to do something similar for Vietnam. He visited the country very shortly after the conclusion of war in 1975. When he came back to the United States, he wrote a series of reports on Vietnam's reconstruction needs and also announced a $1 million scientific exchange program. But what these different aids and help initiatives have in common was that even if they were born in the opposition to the war, after 1975, they have the common goal of trying to promote the normalizations of relations between the United States and Vietnam. They were not trying to provide an alternative as during wartime, but rather they were doing these different donation campaigns, etc., in order to show that there is widespread support in American society for normal relations with Vietnam, and therefore to argue with US government officials that they should normalize their relations. However, for a variety of political and geopolitical relations, this did not come to pass, at least in the late 1970s. And so scientists and those who were still committed to the cause of reconstruction in Vietnam sought out an alternative in a kind of alternative organization, which will form the second part of my talk today. The US Committee for Scientific Cooperation with Vietnam was founded in 1978 with, once again, Arthur Carlson, who has been involved in the Scientific Aid to Indochina initiative. And here are the pictures, I guess, except for the middle, of the three initial founders of the initiative, representing scientists across the United States. Carlson on the East Coast, Edward Cooperman was a nuclear physicist at the California State University, Fullerton. He was also the first chair of this US committee, and he represented the West Coast. And in the middle, we have Lê Văn Hóa, who is a medical radiologist at the Chicago Medical School. I haven't been able to find a photo of him, so instead here's his very impressive CV. But if anyone has a picture of him or know details about him, please let me know. So the U.S. committee, as it was known colloquially, would grow to include more than 500 members across the U.S. And it has close ties with similar associations in France, Australia, and other Western countries. And in place of the U.S. government, the U.S. committee presided over most scientific cooperation between Vietnamese research institutions and American counterparts over the 1980s. And some of the most significant we can tell is that thanks to the relationship between the US committee and the Vietnamese government, research on Agent Orange, collaborative research on Agent Orange began between Americans and Vietnamese scientists much earlier than any intergovernmental mechanism was in place. The US committee was also careful to observe the government's distinction between development and humanitarian aid and try to stay on the right side of the distinction, but they also worked to steadily expand their cooperation and aid programs, and by the 1990s they were running about 40 programs in partnership with 11 ministries in Vietnam, ranging in any field ranging from the natural science, social science, engineering, and medicine. And the US committee, the members and leadership of the committee appealed to the success of apolitical scientific exchange framed as a humanitarian act to prove that the two countries and two societies were ready for normal relations. However, their advocacy made them vulnerable to those who did not agree with that priority. And this case is most clearly demonstrated in the case of the man on the right, you can see here, on your left. Edward Cooperman, the first chair of the US committee. So like many scientists who joined the movement, Cooperman had been active in the civil rights and the disarmament and the anti-Vietnam War movement in the 1960s and 70s. His sympathetic view of Vietnam was well known and even respected in the community. He not only coordinated US scientists, but also worked closely with Vietnamese groups on the West Coast who were arranging the transportation and shipment of very modest reconstruction, but still symbolically significant reconstruction aid to Vietnam. And by 1984, he was running about 35 different projects between the US committee and the Vietnamese government. But this was a period where, as the cynical saying goes, no good deeds goes unpunished. And this is especially true when it comes to Cooperman. In 1984, he was shot and killed in his university office by a Vietnamese refugee who had been his student. And his killing occurred against the backdrop of several assassinations claimed by anti-communist militant groups of Vietnamese American journalists who had supported engagement with Hanoi. And so this raised suspicion that Cooperman's case was politically motivated, and it led to a very long, protracted legal battle between Cooperman's supporters and the suspect's legal defense team, which I won't be going into here. What I think is significant about this is that, in contrast to speculations on the political motivations behind the case, Cooperman's colleagues unequivocally affirmed that his activities with the US committee had been in no way political, but rather, quote, deeply humanitarian. And the committee could only be regarded as being political insofar as, another quote, the art of, insofar as politics was regarded as the arts of making peaceful and civilized relations between nations, which in the end was ultimately a humanitarian end. And so in terms of rhetorical strategy and also political priority, this coupling between a humanitarian organization and also a commitment to advocacy for normalization was reinforced by Cooperman's successor. And after Cooperman's death, this person on the left, Dr. Judith Ladinsky, a professor of preventive medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, took over the position of chair of the US committee and continue ongoing projects. Ladinsky, by profession, was trained in what we now know as public health, and she had worked with the US committee to implement several training programs for rural health workers in Vietnam since 1980. She also engaged in, personally engaged in the shipment of much needed drugs, equipment, and even live organs for transplants from the United States to Vietnam when those were not easy to find and necessary for surgeries in Vietnam. But she also made connections with the highest levels of the US and Vietnamese governments, and sometimes could engage in what I would call high-profile acts of humanitarianism aimed at demonstrating the need for governmental collaboration and normalization. So for instance, in 1985, after learning of a Vietnamese refugee in Chicago who desperately needed a bone marrow transplant from a family member, all of whom had remains in Vietnam, Ladinsky worked with both the US and Vietnamese authorities to expedite the travel of the patient's younger brother from the Mekong Delta to the Midwest in order to save the man. Sadly, the patient did not make it. He still died after the transplant because of the medical conditions. But for Ladinsky and not a few people in the Vietnamese and American and Vietnamese Americans community regarded this endeavor as a great humanitarian gesture on the part of both countries, which, according to Ladinsky, showed the need for better communications, cooperations, and normalizations between Vietnam and the United States. And finally, Ladinsky and her committee was also brokering relations between Vietnamese professionals in the US and institutions in Vietnam. So over the course of the late 1980s, and especially after the Vietnamese government implemented the renovation policy, increasingly there are many highly trained, qualified professionals, Vietnamese Americans, who are interested in doing development projects or doing development assistance projects in Vietnam. However, because that was still a pretty sensitive topic within their communities, they would prefer to go through a middleman like the US committee or this project on the right. It's called Transfer of Knowledge Through Expatriate Nationals, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a UNDP project that aims at sending immigrants, even refugees from a country who are highly trained with professional background, back to the country to help with the economic development project. And the UN argued that this would be a much more cost-saving way to do development aid than sending foreign experts to a country. This was also known at the time as a brain gain as opposed to brain drain project. So as you can see, I have excerpted some letters from Vietnamese American professionals sent to Ladinsky expressing their interest And I'm not exactly sure about the number, but we could say that there was not a small interest in this kind of collaboration, and this project took place over the course of the late 1980s and 1990s. So that's a broad overview of the activities of the US Committee on Scientific Cooperation with Vietnam, and I would argue that this was the most significant initiative in upholding people-to-people diplomacy and especially professional exchanges in the 1980s in the absence of commitment from the US government. So for over a decade, the US Committee has upheld contact between Vietnamese Americans and sometimes Vietnamese American scientists. They still keep doing so even after the resumption of US-Vietnam normalized relations, which the US Committee congratulated both parties on. In fact, it was because of these activities that later on, the first US ambassador to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, Pete Peterson, would reportedly honor Judith Ladinsky as the real first ambassador to Vietnam. And there was not a small degree of truth in that. People like Ladinsky, her committee, and hundreds of American scientists who engaged in this kind of cooperative project had laid the foundation for subsequent collaboration by scientists in both countries and even intergovernmental cooperations. So I think that nowadays, since science and technology has once again become regarded as a key pillar in Vietnam's development strategy, and of the newly elevated US-Vietnam relationship, it is worth recalling the challenges of the past as well, and it's worth recalling the civil society actors who laid the foundation for the promises of the future. Thank you.
Hello everyone, hi. My name is Tien-Dung or Tien-Dung Ha, and I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at Stanford, which is about an hour drive away or an hour and a half this morning. Lovely traffic. So the title of my presentation today, before this, I'd like to thank Dr. Tayler for organizing this, and I feel very privileged to be included in this symposium. So thank you. And the title of my presentation today is Governing the Dead, Transnational Politics in the Identification of Vietnamese Martyrs. So this is this presentation derived from my paper, which is still a work in progress, and I envision it to be the first chapter of my dissertation, which outlined this genealogy or history of the Vietnamese effort to address one of its war legacy. And so it's been 5 decades since the end of the Vietnam-American War, and one of the afterlife of the war that it left many big number of casualties as well as missing remains of soldiers. So the Ministry of Labor, Invalid and Social Affairs, so MOLISA, it's a very important ministry to keep in mind. They estimate that about 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers remain has still not been identified. So they have the bones, but they do not know who these bones belong to. And that does not count another at least 250,000 soldiers that whose remain completely went missing. And this is, someone told me, it's a very moderate estimation. The actual number could be even bigger. And So my work trying to look at how the Vietnamese state address this problem. And in this paper, I'm trying to paint a piece of the puzzle of how the Vietnamese government got to this current state of collaborating with the United States, so its former adversary, to help identify the remains of the Vietnamese war dead. So in September 2023, former President Biden visited Hanoi to mark a new level of Vietnam-US relation, which is elevated to the comprehensive strategic partnership. And in this partnership, addressing war legacy is one of the important agendas that the United States government promised to support the Vietnamese in developing a technology-led system for identification of remains from the war. And why this is an important issue is that the Vietnamese bone sample poses a very unique challenges that because it has been buried under very highly acidic soil of the Vietnamese landscape and tropical weather condition. So the DNA, so the bone has been hugely degraded and the DNA is hugely fragmented. So that's why the traditional forensic methods such as mtDNA or short tandem repeat does not work for the Vietnamese bone sample. And that's why there's a need for an advanced DNA workflow that utilize what we call next generation sequencing, which I do not delve into in this paper. So my questions is, so while receiving this, this foreign aid from the US, how do the Vietnamese state actors maintain also their sovereignty over which war dead to be included in the identification project, and maintain control over the biological and data samples of both the dead and the living? Due to the interest of time, I'm going to focus more on the second part of this questions, but I also prepare some slides for the first part, so if you have questions, I'm happy to answer the first part as well. And so my methodology for these chapters mainly draw on document analysis and interview, mostly oral history interviews of scientists, policymakers, and former foreign service officers of both sides who involved in leading to this current bilateral US-Vietnam cooperation. So I structured this paper by presenting different or important timeline in this US-Vietnam technical cooperation, and that look at how the Vietnamese state trying to shift itself away from state-sponsored mediumship toward a more scientific approach to utilizing DNA methods that was pioneered by a small team of scientists at the Vietnam Academy of Science and Technology in Hanoi, using mtDNA technology to verify kinship relation. And what's more interesting for me during my research is that before the Vietnamese government reached out to the US government, they actually tried to find other international scientific collaborators to help with the issue of the Vietnamese war dead. And one of that collaborator is actually Argentina. So Argentina actually went through military dictatorship in 1976 to 1983, which led to also mass numbers of missings. And that led to an organization called Spanish. I can't speak Spanish, so but I'm gonna try to portray El Equipo Argentino de Antropológica Forense. So basically, the Argentine forensic anthropology team. It is very much an activist and family based, using DNA method to help identify the remains of the Argentine missing. And so in 2012, the Vietnamese government reached out to the EAF to ask for help in developing a DNA workflow that would work with the Vietnamese bone samples. And so in this photo, yes, you can see in 2015, three forensic experts from the EAF team came to Vietnam to work with local professionals from different laboratories and as well as local technicians to exhume 40 remains from a cemetery in Nguyen, as you can see in the photos. And I interviewed or I spoke to one of the scientists Argentine scientists who was sent to help Vietnam in 2015, and he also the director of the forensic lab of EAF. And I asked him about the scientific outcome and his thought on the cooperation. And he argued that Vietnamese bone sample, as I quote, were the worst that we have processed because of, I quote, badly preserved conditions. In addition, he pointed out that the lack of metadata, so the data of family member, of relative, also data of battlefields, because of lack of those to combine with genetic data, it led to many challenges in the ability of scientists to do statistical calculation. And more importantly, Dr. Vuo devoted his own knowledge about why Vietnam did not seek help from the United States earlier, but Argentina instead, without me even asking. And I quote, he told me that, I forgot telling you that the Vietnamese authorities did not contact the US government for request help, probably due to politics differences. That's why they contacted the Argentine one. We were informed that Vietnam has signed an agreement that allowed the US to take remains of American combatants to be identified in their own laboratories, but never worked on Vietnamese soldiers. And so anthropologists such as Sarah Wagner and also Christina Schrenko here have talked about the effort of US government looking and recovering American combatants from Vietnam through the Vietnam Office of Missing Person, the VNO SMP. So Dr. Vuo was correct on that front, and a lot of you here could have guessed what he meant by the politics difference between the US and Vietnam and why the Vietnamese government did not reach out to the US government earlier for help with the Vietnamese soldier. And one of that differences is the politics of inclusion and exclusion of remains, or which war that is to be included in the identification project. Mainly, the US government advocated for the inclusion of South Vietnamese remains, which was not taken well by the Vietnamese government, which partly led to the delay in two countries really coming together to address the Vietnamese missing war debt. And so, what more significant about this alliance between Vietnam and Argentina to me is that it produced a new or a novel dimension of global flows of technology transfer and knowledge exchange that does not involve the West. If this alliance had worked out, it would have fostered solidarity among two post-war and post-conflict nations. But it did not work out because, for many reasons, because the EAF laboratory does not have the advanced DNA workflow that would work with the Vietnamese bone sample, and also there's a regime change in the Argentine government in 2015. And also another point would be a closer relationship between US and Vietnam in building trust and trying to navigate this past and current political difference. That which led us to 2019. At the request of the Vietnamese government and the lobbying of American state actors, including Senator Patrick Leahy and political aide Tim Reiser. Okay. So at the request of the Vietnamese government and the lobbying of American state actors, including Senator Patrick Leahy and Tim Reiser, the U.S. allocated funds from their National Defense Authorization Act for about $3 million a year for 5 years to this project called the Vietnamese War Accounting Initiative. And in this Vietnamese War Accounting Initiative, there are many agendas, one of which include improving DNA analysis capacity for the Vietnamese government. And this actually was signed into law by Trump during his first administration. I'm sorry. I'm sorry?
It's signed by
Trump, Donald Trump, yeah, during his first administration. And so with this funding, which was overseen or oversight by USAID, for S&P, by USAID, the Vietnamese government and USAID invited a third party, which is a scientific forensic lab in the Netherlands, The Hague, called the International Commission on Missing Persons, the ICMP, to be the technical consultant and the technical consultant for the grant to help the Vietnamese lab, or the Vietnam Academy of Science and Technology lab, developing this new DNA workflow. And they also received training and equipment from this funding. And so in this photo right here, this is taken on July 26, 2023. This is one of the first workshops organized in Hanoi that brought together all the stakeholders from VAS, USAID, ICMP, and the VNO SMP. So to discuss the DNA extraction, actually, the result of the first DNA extraction of the first 15 or 100 bone remains. And so prior to this meeting, prior to this workshop, USAID hosted a meeting for the Vietnamese War Accounting Initiative. It's a smaller meeting in a USAID building in Hanoi, attended by members of USAID, USIP, and ICMP. So Andrew, he was there, so he can be witness to my next. He can be my witness to my next argument. So in that meeting, ICMP General Director, so she's the lady in the center. ICMP General Director Catherine Bamberger, she give an overview of what ICMP is and how they're going to help Vietnam develop this new DNA workflow. And one of her main argument was she kept stressing for the need of a centralized database to store DNA data of both the dead and the living. Because at the time, in July 2023, in Vietnam, MOLISA, so remember the Ministry of Labor, Environment and Social Affairs, they're the one who collect and maintain family reference samples. Whereas there's 3 forensic laboratories within Vietnam. So the forensic lab in the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Public Security, and VAS, they each have their own database system to store the DNA data of bone sample. So it's a very fragmented and decentralized database approach that would actually impede the effort to do a DNA matching between DNA, the family reference sample, and DNA of bone sample. So that's why ICMP emphasized the timely need to collect DNA sample of the living who are dying. But this suggestion actually received a lot of pushback from the Vietnamese local USAID officer at the time, because they argue that it's almost impossible for Vietnam to come together to develop this centralized database, and also that at this current stage they should only focus on develop a workable DNA workflow for the Vietnamese bone sample. But what no one had expected at that meeting was that exactly around a year later, near the National Martyrs Day in Vietnam, so around July 27, 2024, the Vietnamese government announced the National Gene Bank that going to collect DNA of family of the martyrs in order to identify and return the remains of the martyr back to the family. And what's more interesting is that this National Gene Bank, which is overseen by the Ministry of Public Security, in collaboration with Gene Story, it is a private biotech company that is part of Vingroup, which is the largest conglomerate in Vietnam. So Gene Story offers medical testing services that predict genetic susceptibilities to certain diseases such as diabetes, breast cancer, cardiovascular diseases, as well as genetic responses to drugs and pharmaceutical treatments. And I didn't include this next few slides in the paper because this article just came out. But here, just this year, they developed what they call VinGen chip. So it is, VinGen chips is a microarray SNP chips that can analyze thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNP or genetic markers on the genome. And in particular, it can detect genetic variant, very specific just to the Vietnamese population. And this VinGen chip is currently being applied in the National Martyr Gene Bank project to identify, to help with identifying martyr and their relative. And so what's more interesting about this gene chips, VinGen chips, is that it was developed as the result of the Decoding 1000 Vietnamese Genome project that Vingroup had launched in 2018 and completed around 2020. And if you can read, this is Võ Trí Nam, he's the Chief Technology Officer. He gave an interview about the application of this VinGen chip. He argued that, he pointed out that the idea of a chip was first born to solve the problem. The problem he mentioned here is the lack of a microarray SNP that tailored to the Vietnamese population. So that's why the Vingroup or Gene Story integrated genetic variation characteristic of Vietnamese people into the design and ensuring much higher efficiency in current commercial chips. The original main purpose of these chips were to serve the medical needs. And as he said, and what's next is even more interesting. The chips can screen for disease risk and drug response and can also be used to discover personal inclination and physical potential based on genes, thereby creating a personalized education and training program to achieve optimal results. Let me put it this way, genetic factors have a certain influence on physical development and sport performance. So if a child is found to have a genetic predisposition for endurance, then they should do long distance running or swimming, while if a child with a genetic predisposition for speed should be doing training in sprinting rather than the other way around. So if you keep going with this logic, it's not far away from genetic disposition for intelligence, and that led to a very neo-eugenic way of thinking. And another question that I have is, when they mention these chips integrate genetic variation of Vietnamese population based on the result that they found from the 1000 Vietnamese Genome Project, which they launched years earlier, which Vietnamese they're talking about here? So I dive into the scientific paper of that 1000 Genome Project, and I found that the 1011 sample that they collected to decode the Vietnamese genome is Vietnamese individual declared as king ethnic. So it's only, as you all know here, Vietnamese is 54 ethnic groups, all have involved in the war. But the only Vietnamese that are included in this VinGen chip and later will be held for DNA matching with the martyrs, that's only include the Vietnamese king sample. And conclusion, very quick. So despite my conclusion is that despite receiving US funding, the Vietnamese state assert sovereignty by recognizing only martyrs who fought for the North Vietnam army and excluding those who fought for the former South Vietnam region, thereby transforming acts of scientific care into instrument of political commemoration. I also show how the Vietnamese state leveraged this foreign aid funded project to establish infrastructure for a national gene bank extending forensic identification into a biopolitical project of collecting population-wide genetic data. In this way, the intimate search for kin became entangled with state biopolitical projects tied to biomedical economies and population governance. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Hear me okay? Yes. All right. My name's Zach Tayler. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm humbled to be here alongside such esteemed scholars and upstanders in this community. The title of my presentation is U.S. Vietnamese Normalization, Linkage Diplomacy, 1986 to 1988. This research, this presentation will stem from, be a portion of the 5th chapter of my dissertation, which examines broadly the normalization of diplomatic relations from 1975 to 1995, the United States and Vietnam. I'd also like to mention that I have not yet been to Vietnam. I'm going in the spring to conduct archival research there for the first time, so I'm excited to incorporate my findings there into my broader dissertation. However, what I have been able to incorporate accessible Vietnamese language sources thus far. So the thesis, my arguments for this presentation today is I argue that from the time that Hanoi's leadership enacted Doi Moi at the 6th Party Congress until the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency, Vietnam did not significantly alter its diplomacy with the United States. And there's 3 ways that I will show this. The first is that Hanoi's leadership did not seriously change its negotiating tactics it had been engaged with for decades with the United States. Secondly, the Reagan administration took concrete steps to show its seriousness about fostering better relations with Hanoi. And third, that it was a decrease in Cold War tensions that pressured the Vietnamese to moderate their diplomacy with the U.S., such as seeing the end of its occupation of Cambodia. Now, first I'm going to real quickly go through 1975 to 1985. So immediately following the end of the Vietnam War, Hanoi's leadership was very confident in its negotiating position. They were open to normalization with the United States, but only on the condition that they would receive over $3 billion of post-war aid, this Reconstruction. This was something that no American president was interested in. For Gerald Ford, the remainder of his administration, there was really only one significant normalization talk that occurred, and that was in November 1976 after the presidential election. So there was not any serious movement there. Now, Jimmy Carter's administration, as it has been mentioned a couple times already, was very open to normalizing with Vietnam with no preconditions. And so there were several talks, normalization talks in 1977, and they continued into 1978. It was September 1978 when Vietnam finally dropped its demand for linking, its demand for aid for normalization. By that point, though, its relations with the PRC had deteriorated, its relations with Cambodia had deteriorated, its relations with the Soviet Union had improved dramatically, and so by that point, the Carter administration was much more hesitant to normalize. And then several months after that, in December 1978, of course, Vietnam invaded Cambodia, essentially shelving the prospects of normalization between the U.S. and Vietnam. Shortly thereafter, Vietnam entered this was known as the subsidy period, where it became essentially economically dependent on the Soviet Union, and it just was a very its society, its economy just deteriorated significantly during this period. I want to introduce Mikhail Gorbachev into this story. In March 1985, when he became premiership of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union being the principal financial backer of Vietnam, Hanoi's leadership was very attentive to the moves, the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. So when Gorbachev started to implement reforms, this was something that Hanoi's leadership was observed very carefully. And of course, at the Sixth Party Congress in December 1986 is when they initiated their own reform movement. Now, really quickly, leading up to this period with the Reagan administration, the diplomacy between the United States and Vietnam from 1981 up until this point, really throughout Reagan's presidency, was really grounded in humanitarian issues, primarily the pre-OW MIA issue, but over time you also saw the resettlement of Amerasians, Vietnamese political prisoners, and so coming up to immediately following the Sixth Party Congress, you saw Hanoi's leadership really having a greater desire for higher level talks. This gentleman, Richard Childress, was a member of Reagan's National Security Council, and he had really led alongside other officials such as Ann Mills Griffiths, who led the POW League. But Childress really led the United States talks with the Vietnamese up until this time. So Vietnam wanted higher level talks and an end, they would say, to this hostile attitude. They would always kind of use that in negotiations. The United States needed to end its hostile attitude, whether it was the U.S. government or the U.S. media or dissidents, and every time, U.S. officials would say, well, we can't control that. That's not what we do. But in any case, Vietnam also demanded linkage, right? So by this point, they had been cooperating off and on, but generally consistently on the POW MIA issue. And so by this point, they really felt that there needed to be some reciprocity from the United States.